Hi, Misha here, and we've worked our way through the MiGs, and we've talked about the SU-27 and its variants, and it just didn't seem right not to revisit the SU-25, even though I don't have any new models to show you, just the two I've had. This is an earlier one from the late 80s Afghanistan, and this is an updated one from 2015 Syria. The SU-25 is a close air support, a strike aircraft, jet-powered, subsonic, very much analogous to Russia's A-10. In fact, it was built with some inspiration from the A-10 during its own development. And it has been produced in quite a large number, over 1,000, and is still in Russian service as well as Ukrainian and others to this very day. And yeah, it really fits a certain niche on the battlefield that Russia needed, even if they didn't know it at the first. And even though it was a low priority, it eventually did go into production, but it took a while. So yeah, we'll just talk about the story for a bit. Why not? It's always cool to talk about Russian aircraft. And the story really can be traced back to World War II, whereas the Allies, mainly the British and Americans, pretty much just customized existing aircraft, Spitfires, Hurricanes really, later Typhoons, and of course in America the P-47 and P-51. They would basically just work these into the close air support, the fighter bomber role. Russia had the Ilyushin IL-2 and later IL-10, which were dedicated ground attack, close air support, strike aircraft, and very effective at that. Germany had a few of its own, including the Junkers 87 and the 88 for that matter. At least in some configuration, it could do this. But after the war, the Soviets kind of went to the Western way of looking at things, of just kind of reworking fighters into being fighter bombers, or as they were known, mud fighters. And as I mentioned in the MiG-15 and MiG-17 videos, it wasn't very good. It was better than nothing, and that's about all you could say about it. Now, Sukhoi had produced a few fighter bomber-esque type planes like the SU-7 and really the SU-17. And MiG did work to make its 21 more of a multi-role craft, whereas in the beginning it was an interceptor mostly. And then, of course, when it developed the 23, it would make a ground attack version known as the 27, but again, they're just taking the fighter and making it into this. Really, they were too expensive, too fast, and too lightly armored for a true close air support role. Plus, their ability to operate from less than ideal airfields wasn't always the greatest. So the idea was to revisit the IL-10, essentially, updating it for jet power. And there was a program in the 1950s, the IL-40, which became the IL-42, but this was nixed by Khrushchev, and it was revisited by the Ilyushin Company in the 60s, when it was clear that Russia would need such an aircraft. In 1968, Sukhoi kind of worked on a design, and in 1969, the competition was announced for the VVS's close support, tactical support, and it really came down to the Ilyushin 42, which became the 102, and the SU design, which started off as the T8 prototype. And Sukhoi would eventually win and be tasked with building two prototypes in 1972, the first of which was completed in 1974, and the first one flew at the beginning of 74, and the beginning of 75, and the second one flew late that year. Now, originally they were going to go for afterburning engines. The VVS wanted a supersonic or at least transonic craft. They realized this just wasn't realistic, so they would go to the R95SH engine, which was actually a non-afterburning variant of the same engine that the MiG-21 used. So it was tried and tested. Sturdy is the best thing for it, and powerful, but also blunt force. On the other hand, you could pretty much give it anything to burn and it would burn. It was not picky about the type of aviation fuel. It could even process diesel, at least, in an absolute pinch. So things were on track by 1975, but this was such a low priority aircraft. The SU-24, the Fencer, and the SU-27, the Flanker, both had higher priorities, not to mention all the MiGs. In fact, Sukhoi lost its production facility. And so for a time, even though the design was kind of getting close to being ready, especially the T-8-2 prototype, they didn't know where to build it. This is why they started construction in Georgia, not Russia proper. And they would find the factory in 1978, begin construction there, and the first Georgian-built pre-production model would take to the skies in September of 1979. And from there, of course, the war in Afghanistan would kick off. So in early 1980, they would send 2 late production prototypes or pre-production models, T-8s, for a 50-day field trial. And they would fly 100 missions, and commanders really liked them. They gave them something that they just didn't have before, and they operated well alongside combat helicopters, eventually the MiL Mi-24 Hind. So what exactly do we have here? Introduced into service is the SU-25. The NATO code name was FROGFOOT, and the Russians nicknamed it the Rook, which not a chess piece, but actually kind of a crow, the bird rook. Anyway, so it is smaller than an A-10 Warthog, but not by as much as you might think. Now, the Warthog has a wingspan of about 57.5 feet. This has a wingspan of a little over 47 feet, so definitely a smaller wingspan. But overall length, the A-10 is a little over 53 feet long. Well, this is about 51 feet long. So lengthwise, not much shorter. Like the A-10, it has 2 engines. It is subsonic. Now, it cannot carry as much as the A-10. The A-10 can carry about 16,000 pounds. The FROGFOOT here can carry about 9,700 pounds. And while it has a 30mm cannon like the A-10, it doesn't carry near the ammunition, just 250 rounds, and it doesn't have the rate of fire. It's not a Gatling cannon. So, not as terrifying of a gun. Ironically, they both do have 11 hardpoints under the aircraft, though. But it's not all lost. One thing that the FROGFOOT has over the A-10 is speed. The A-10, well, it struggles to get up to 430, 440 miles per hour. The FROGFOOT can get up over 600 miles per hour. That's kind of a relic of when they wanted it to be a supersonic aircraft. So that is one advantage. It was also, like many Soviet aircraft, cheaper to produce and maintain. And while it isn't maybe as rugged as the A-10, it is rugged. Having 2 engines was good, but unlike the A-10, they are pretty close together. This would have some problems later on. Like the A-10, we have an armored cockpit. It is what they call a bathtub. It's a titanium tub that the pilot sits in here. He's actually very well protected. It's rated up to 20mm, even 23mm. Maybe not absolute direct hits, but indirect hits. It's certainly small caliber, so he's well protected. The downside, it's a very cramped cockpit, and visibility stinks, especially rearward. There is a periscope to look back, but that's about it. So he's kind of cramped, a little claustrophobic, but considering this was meant to fly at low altitudes, just hanging over the battlefield, loitering, it only has a maximum altitude of about 23,000 to 24,000 feet, but then again, it's not meant to go any higher anyway. He probably appreciated the protection. And the whole fuselage is armored. Of course, we have self-sealing fuel tanks. We have chaff and flare dispensers in the back. And we, of course, carry a wide range of munitions. Nearly 10,000 pounds is nothing to sneeze at. And originally, this would carry dumb bombs, iron bombs, rocket pods, cluster munitions. It did carry an air-to-air missile, air defense missile, one on each outer pylon or hardpoint. This one has the R-60 on them. They could carry the older K-13. So you have 2 missiles for self-defense. That's kind of the same as the A-10, the Warthog. It also has two sidewinders for self-defense, for what it's worth. So, but we have our 30mm cannon. It can also carry up to 2 23mm cannon pods under the wings, each of them holding 260 shells. One neat thing, they were bidirectional. You could either mount them pointing forward, and they could also be pivoted down slightly, or you could actually mount them pointing backwards to kind of cover the aircraft's retreat. Kind of neat. Simple, but effective. Yeah, mostly this used rockets and bombs, napalm, that kind of thing. It did have a laser targeting system in the nose, although because of its nature, you really needed one SU-25 to use the laser as a designator, and then another SU-25 to actually launch the munitions. And it had some, range finding capabilities, and that was kind of its primary use. Of course, we have dual pitot tubes in the front, kind of interesting. And we have very interesting air brakes on the wingtips. Very unconventional there. But all in all, simple, sturdy, yet nevertheless impressive aircraft. And more importantly, it was exactly what Russia needed in Afghanistan, even though it had been such a low priority. Thankfully, it was coming into production right when they needed it. History doesn't often give that kind of coincidence, but for the sake of Russian soldiers and kind of the disgruntlement of the Mujahideen, they did this time. As you know, I mostly collect Hobbymaster and Corgi, and Corgi doesn't do much in the way of Russian, so this is a Hobbymaster and 172 scale diecast. And as you know, I buy a lot from Pete's Collectibles down in Texas. Hey, us small businesses gotta stick together. That seems to be both of our opinions towards each other. Anyway, he's always helped me out, and he's always willing to talk and describe things, so he sent this one to me. This was my first SU-25. This one's kind of neat from Hobbymaster. They've only done 5, I think, maybe 6. Sorry, I didn't mean to push you down. And this is the only one that's actually the original SU-25. And this is from Afghanistan, 1987, 1988 time period. 1981 was a very big year for the plane. It was approved for full production in March, and the first planes were delivered to the VVS in April. And by May, they had nearly a dozen in service, and on July 19th, the first ones were sent to Afghanistan, and they were very quickly put into service, hitting mountain fortifications and strongholds, they could get in there low and slow enough to attack something that other jets like the MiG-23s, the B versions, could not, yet they had more payload and they were a lot tougher than, say, a helicopter. This could take a direct hit and keep on a ticking. At this time they were using dumb bombs and rockets, and were quite successful and well liked. In 1984, they would actually up from 1 full unit to 2 in Afghanistan, and they would fly pretty continuously again alongside the the MiL-24. But then the Stinger missile came, and in 1986-87, at least 4 SU-25s were lost to Stinger missiles, and this would kind of result in a refit of the design a bit. The problem with this engine structure, even though there's 2 engines, which redundancy is good, but they're very close together. So if one of them were hit with a missile and started to catch fire, it would quickly spread to the other engine, knocking them both out. Not good. So what they did, they installed a firewall, a break in here, and then they also installed the fire extinguishing system. On top of that, we already had some chaff launchers in the back here. Well, they installed more on top of the engine nacelles here. So additional chaff to try to deflect the missile. And finally, later in production, they would go to an improved R-195 engine. And also, whereas early on it was unguided ordnance, late in Afghanistan they would start using some guided bombs. I guess we could call them early smart bombs. Not a whole lot. They launched fewer than 150, but some. And they'd be turning these out quite well. They were well liked by the guys on the ground. Close air support aircraft usually are well appreciated. And of course you could have a pretty good payload option down here. One thing I should point out, the 2 inner hardpoints are both plumbed, so you could have up to 4 external fuel tanks, but rarely, if ever, would they do more than 2, because the outer points were only for defensive missiles. Meaning if you have 4 fuel tanks and the missile, not really leaving much in the way of ordnance. Plus, unlike, say, the MiG, these weren't especially thirsty, all things considered. They were also able to operate very close to the front because they could work from airstrips under 400 feet long. And the way their tires were set up, they could take a pretty good beating when taking off and landing without a huge amount of consequence. They had a full ejection seat, of course, to make them more survivable. In fact, it was the derivative that Sukhoi was using in their SU-27, just optimized for this aircraft's role. And like I said, they would go to an improved engine later on in production. They would also make a foreign export version known as the SU-25K, and while several nations purchased it, probably the most famous user in the 80s would be Iraq. They used these a lot against Iran during their war, and Saddam Hussein loved them. And they would continue service into the Gulf War, 1991. But many were destroyed on the ground by Allied aircraft. Some would flee to Iran, and those that stayed were quickly shot down by the F-15s. So, yeah. They aren't going to do well there. When the Soviet Union left Afghanistan, there were about 50 FROGFOOTs in theater. And then when the USSR collapsed, Russia had about 220 in its inventory. And Ukraine had about 80. And Belarus had around 100. And several other nations had, more here and there as well. So, they would continue on. And because of their sturdy design, they were easy to refit and repair and get them back in the action. So a lot like the A-10 in that sense. And these models are really neat because of all the cool ordnance options you can put on them. Plus, Red Star. But, of course, the SU-25 story was very much far from over, even with the Cold War. So with that, let's move into the 21st century. So let's put the newer SU-25 SM on the stand. Now, Russia, like I said, had quite a few FROGFOOTs after the collapse of the USSR, and they would soon use them in the First Chechen War in 1994. And while they would do respectably well, it showed that they were still using mostly unguided munitions, and that Russian techniques, tactics, had not really progressed since the Afghan War era. In other words, they were just getting outdated. So they did lose some there. So after the war was over in 96, they would take what they had, and then in 98, they kind of decided to do a midlife upgrade, refurbishing them to give them more flight hours and more modern electronics and weapons. Between 99 and 2000, they would study what to do, what they could afford, because it needed to be done on a budget. And at the end of 2002, the first prototype would fly. It should also be stated that they would use these again during the Second Chechen War, beginning in 1999. In any case, by 2006, the first half dozen reworked machines were in VVS, later VKS service, and the number would slowly rise. For example, in 2012, they had 30 in service, and by the time of the model here, 2015, it was over 50. Ultimately, the Russian Air Force plans to have between 100 and 130 reworked machines. And what we have, most of the changes are internal. Of course, it has the ability to work with newer, more modern munitions. We have a redone cockpit with the improved heads-up display. We have a new modern digital avionics suite, targeting system, what have you. We have a new configuration for chaff and flare in the back here. We have a GPS system now. The aircraft is actually a little bit lighter because of the newer electronics, replacing the old chunky ones from the Soviet era. The engines were refurbished and upgraded as needed. And they gave them a new paint scheme. And they gave a little bit of radar absorbing paint in a few areas, honestly just because. So, kind of a very typical upgrade program. But, when you look at the A-10A versus the A-10C, it's not a radical change either. Just doing what needed to be done. Like I said, this model here is from Syria. Russia would first send some FROGFOOTs over in September of 2015, and on October 2nd they would go on their first mission to strike terrorist camps, and they would fly a large number of missions through the spring of 2016. Then they would be drawn down, but then they'd be back in theater by October of that year, and kind of in and out of the region, flying alongside the SU-34. and really just doing a lot of bomb delivery and ground attacking, and just generally speaking, loitering and providing close air support, what they're supposed to do. Very much in Russian service right up to this current present day. Taking this one off the stand, this is actually the first release Hobbymaster did for the FROGFOOT, although I picked it up from Pete's about a year ago, just to have a modern one. There's, like I said, a few differences, mostly to do with the tail, this area. And of course the payload is a little different here, more in line with what it would have been carrying in Syria there. This still has the R60, but these can carry the newer R73 as well, but they can't really take full advantage of its guidance because of, well, just the avionics of this aircraft. So it's a little bit of a waste. Like most Hobbymasters, really all of them, you have gear up and down, you have canopy, can be displayed opened or closed, pilot figure in or out. Usual Hobbymaster features. It's a neat aircraft, really is. They do another one. The second release was actually Ukrainian, the SU-25 M1. Remember I said Ukraine had about 80 after the collapse of the USSR? Well, they too refurbished and updated theirs, and actually used them quite a bit in 2014 and the whole Crimea thing. And both sides, pro-Russian and Ukrainian forces, had the FROGFOOT, but they were a little more iconic in Ukrainian hands. But they did kind of go up, not directly against each other, but both were used in that conflict. Also that year, Russia would sell 4 or 5 refurbished SU-25s to the new Iraqi government for use against Islamic State terrorist targets. So, even though it's old, it's still well liked. It's easy to train pilots on. It's quite forgiving. Of course, there is a 2-seat training version, the SU-25 UBM. Well, UB and then later UBM, the updated version. And frankly, a close air support aircraft like this doesn't need to be fast and then with the most modern technology. It needs to be dependable and able to deliver a payload. And these newer versions, thanks to the updates, are quite accurate, especially with either GPS or laser targeting data. Even without it, they can still put a bomb more or less where it needs to go, because this was a purpose-built close air support aircraft, and it really shows. And the model here from Hobbymaster is just really cool. The tail is plastic, the fins, but then the wing and the body is all metal. So it's pretty chunky. And of course it has all your pylons for attaching things. Quite fun. There you have it. Like I said, I really just felt like we had to give the SU-25 an updated video. Plus, it's an excuse to get these off the shelf because they're a cool aircraft. As I said, Hobbymaster has only done 5 or 6 of these. And they're all Russian, except for the one Ukrainian. And they're all the modern SM or M1 variants, except for this one over here. I think it would be neat to do an Iraqi one from the Iraq-Iran war from the 1980s. Just a thought. And they could do the SU-25 SM3, the most modern update, although Russia's having some trouble with the SM3 program from what a few sources say, but I haven't really checked up on it in some time. Anyway, just thought we would talk about this. Why not? I enjoy it. Hope you enjoy it. And appreciate you tuning in. As always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. And hopefully I got something on camera for you. If not, at least you get to hear me ramble about history. It might even be somewhat correct. Who knows? This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.